About 1 in 3 Americans between 18 and 34 years old live with their parents.
That's actually a very interesting stat. I'm excited about this video just because if you had asked me how many people I know that still live with their parents that are around my age, I probably would have said 20 to 30%. So it's interesting that this is something that's holding true for a number of other individuals. Um, Times are just tough right now. I think this has certainly been a trend. I know healthcare is big, but probably the primary aspect is likely education costs. I feel like that will certainly come up in this video as if you're a young adult and you come out of college with maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, it's going to be really hard for you to pay that off and have a place that you can rent out on your own. More likely than not, you'd probably have to have roommates one way or the other, and that's still probably more expensive than just living at your parents' house if you have that opportunity. So, definitely curious to see what they have to say on this topic.
And while you may have heard more about this recently, this trend isn't new.
Between 2005 and 2015, the share just grew very steeply over this 10-year period. Since then, it's been
That is interesting. It seems to have gone up. They're highlighting basically from around 2003, 2004 ish is when this trend actually started to pick up, which is interesting. But again, I think this likely is going to be tied to things like education costs, which didn't just suddenly bump up in like 2020 two or something like that. So this is likely going to be impacted by that. But it's interesting that it also preceded like the Great Recession in like 2008. So curious to see if they'll flag any other aspects that are impacting this number.
fairly stable. There was an uptick, of course, during the pandemic. In the wake of the pandemic, those rates of parental co-residence are now about where they were right before. Part of the reason we see this escalation of young adults not leaving the nest or returning to the nest is this idea that it was harder and harder for them to weather shocks.
Nearly 30% of Gen Z said they would like to save, but don't make enough money. And roughly 2 in 5 millennials and Gen Z adults feel it's harder to build financial wealth now than when their parents were their age because of the economy. 27-year-old Victoria Franklin has been living with her mother in New Jersey since she graduated college in 2019.
I saw all of the money that I was saving, and I thought, maybe I should stay home for a little bit, and I didn't feel an urgency to move out.
Not everyone is enthusiastic about this trend.
You guys are making six figures together. You can't tell me you can't afford a house. They just don't want to spend their money.
Told ya.
36% of Americans said in a 2022 survey that more young adults living with their parents is bad for society.
So it's definitely an interesting concept. Again, I think this is the individual's aunt. Also, is this that individual's house, their parents' house? This is a crazy awesome house, I gotta say. If my parents had a house this big, I would definitely be living there. I don't know if I would leave, so that could be a whole other topic of this video. But I think she brought up an interesting point, which is she was highlighting kind of how much this individual makes. Um, and the fact that they probably could live someplace else. Obviously, home prices themselves have more recently come up, which wouldn't explain something starting in like 2004, though I guess arguably prices in 2004 were increasing all the way up into the Great Recession. So that could be a similar time in the market. But there's a variety of areas where inflation exists, and these individuals probably, again, could likely pay for, at least many of the people I know, likely could, if they pushed or stretched their budget, could live with roommates. But again, why would you choose to live with a roommate who's going to expect you to pay your fair share of rent, do all these things around the house when you can just live at your parents' house, who is probably going to subsidize most of your living, and you potentially have less responsibilities at home than you would have otherwise. But again, if this is the person's house, I might have to ask them if I can stay there as well, because this is a pretty nice house they have here.
So here's why young Americans are choosing to live with their parents and what the implications are for the U.S. economy.
My name is Victoria Franklin. I am 27 years old, and I live in my childhood home with my mother and my boyfriend.
Victoria graduated from the University of Miami in 2019 and moved in with her mom when she was looking for a job.
And boyfriend. That is a bold move, but they have basically confirmed this is the house. She's getting out of her car, going to the house that they just showed in the previous scene. So I could see having a child. I'm not sure for myself having a child and maybe like a partner of some sort in the house, that like that's a lot. Like for you two to collectively be prioritizing a relationship with another human being when you can't really support yourself sounds irresponsible to me, and definitely something that you should probably reconsider. Most likely they're going out, they're going on dates, doing various activities. I'm sure there is a cost associated with that versus just trying to hunker down and try to save and get things done and try to get yourself set up for life. That's pushing it in my opinion, but this is definitely something I've heard from other folks. But we'll see what they have to say on this front.
After I saw the cost of living and things like that after I graduated, that maybe I'd be home for about a year.
More than half of Gen Z adults say they don't make enough money to live the life they want due to high cost of living.
I ended up bartending and waitressing until October, where I got my first offer, so it did take a little bit longer than I expected.
I feel like I'm making a lot of comments here and the video's barely started, but there's just so many things that are interesting that they've already covered here. So the way they phrased that statement was they can't live the life that they want. Maybe I'm getting already cynical based off of the example that they gave for this video, which is this individual who presumably has comes from wealthy parents who are in New Jersey and have multiple glass shelves behind them with things in this very sizable home that they have. And so this likely is also another aspect, which is this individual almost certainly, I would have to believe, could find some place to live, but they probably wouldn't enjoy it. They would likely have to have a reduced quality of life in order to kind of live on their own. And I'm going to assume positively of their parents, where I think 70-80% of like millionaires and things like that are first generation, like they made it to that status on their own. So I'm going to assume that they didn't get handed this house or like wealth from multiple generations. And so if you're entering the workforce and like you're bottom of the totem pole, let's say, like you have very low income, very low experience, you have a lot of debt, you're going to be struggling. Like it's not going to be an easy path for you to just enter the world and basically pick your favorite location in the entire world, have the best views, have the best commute. That's not really what's going to happen. Most people have to build up to this point. And so I guess this individual is sort of like skipping the struggle portion of their life. And so this is where they can just kind of hang out at their parents and kind of take advantage of whatever their parents worked for. And so I thought that was an interesting aspect, and I maybe a cynical take on this, especially considering the individual that they have highlighted here. But again, this is definitely a comfort thing where if the parents are well off or more well off than you would be solo, what does it hurt to try to hang out there? But again, this potentially robs the individual. I think in my mind, the struggles that I've had in my life, I wouldn't have gotten rid of those in my life. I think, in my opinion, the good comes with the bad. And so if I hadn't gone through those struggles, I wouldn't have become the individual I am today. And I like the individual I am today. And I appreciate how I view the world and my work ethic and how I see and interact with other individuals. And I think the struggle that I went through earlier in my life helped me get to that point. And for me, I do think this is somewhat robbing this individual. And while I'm sure at the time, if you had asked me if I enjoyed those struggles, I certainly would have said no. I would have probably opted out, given the opportunity many times. But I think that builds character. I think it gives you resilience and it allows you to take charge of your own life. And I feel like that's something that is potentially getting missed by these individuals behaving this way. Obviously, I don't want to make a blanket statement of like everybody is doing this, but for us to be getting to such a high percentage of individuals and young adults, there's definitely going to be some portion of this. I am projecting quite a bit off of the few things that I believe I know about this individual and their situation, but that is something that I don't know if everybody's also considering, which is it's not necessarily bad for you at the end of the day to have some struggle in your life.
Currently live at the Jersey Shore, and I was commuting into New York City, which takes about 2 hours each way. And I thought, in 6 months or so, I'll move into the city, be closer to the job, and the pandemic threw a wrench in those plans.
Victoria now works a fully remote job, which she says she probably wouldn't have if it weren't for the pandemic. Without a commute to worry about, she was able to stay at her mom's for longer.
It's a lot harder for young people today to save up for, markers of the American dream than it was for previous generations. Part of the reason we see this escalation of young adults not leaving the nest or returning to the nest is this idea that it was harder and harder for them to weather shocks. And so, for example, if they suffered a layoff or they suffered some sort of health shock or they got in a car accident, if they didn't have any additional credit to weather that shock, they would end up moving back home. The financial stability of young adults, their ability to pay for things if they got into an emergency, was one of the big factors influencing whether or not they were living on their own or living with their parents.
A significant number of Gen Z adults and millennials lack emergency savings. In fact, 46% of millennials and 32% of Gen Z have more credit card debt than emergency savings. This can have ramifications for setting up a financial future.
Based off of this title, it sounds like they're going to cover exactly what I highlighted earlier, which is these people almost certainly could have rented. And this isn't, to me, in my opinion, like by yourself. Like you might need 4, 5, 6 roommates. I'm not saying that's going to be an enjoyable time, but again, this seems to be more of like a comfort thing of instead of choosing the hard path and trying to work your way towards better options, then you can almost get comfortable in these situations and then let them linger, like this individual highlighted, which I've seen in other individuals that I know, which is they had planned to leave. The pandemic happened. It's a few years after the pandemic at this point. If they thought 6 months was all they needed to save up, it's definitely been a few years since the pandemic has ended. And so they could have theoretically saved up to do that, but they seemingly haven't at this point in time. But in my personal perspective, if you have a small apartment and you have like a very small bedroom with like 5, 6 roommates, I bet you are going to spend less than 2 years getting your act together to try to save up to at least move into a different place that like maybe you have 2 or 3 roommates instead of, and you'd at least start on this journey of improving your quality of life and making decisions that help you get towards there. Because again, they didn't technically say whether or not this individual was paying their parents for staying, but I'm doubting it at this point in time. And so theoretically that money's going somewhere, and that isn't seemingly going to rent or home purchasing or anything along those lines.
Roughly 1 in 4 Gen Z adults say housing costs are one of the biggest challenges to financial success.
The prices of homes has escalated over the last few decades much faster than actual incomes. So it is actually much harder for a millennial or a Gen Z to save up for a down payment to buy a home. And that's something.
So I do agree with the sentiment that housing prices are definitely less affordable now than they were many generations ago. But I did want to add a caveat there of, I don't know if that's necessarily preventing people from hitting financial success. I know it is part of like the American dream and people see themselves as having financially made it when they have a home, but it might not be right for you to have a home at a young age. I think this is where you're potentially growing in your career, hopefully trying out different jobs, maybe working your way up, and your job could move, you could maybe find other opportunities elsewhere. And so when you buy a home, for it to actually be worthwhile, at least today, I'm not sure what it was like 10, 20, 30 years ago, but you would have to stay in that home for, I think, about 5 to 10 years is the general consensus in order to make that worthwhile. And so if you're young, if you're in like your 20s or early 30s, it might not be beneficial for you to anchor yourself into a location for potentially 5, 10 years when there could be opportunities for you elsewhere. And so I just wanted to highlight that those two things are not the same. Having a house and being financially successful they're not the same thing. They can feel like the same thing, and you might aspire to have a house because that's the perception of what being financially successful is. But you could also be saving a lot of money. You could be investing that money. You could be investing in like a retirement savings plan of some sort, like a 401k, etc. And so you could be very wealthy without owning a home. And in fact, the wealthiest individuals have a much larger portion of their assets in things like the stock market or equity of some sort, and not in a home. And so while many people think of having a home as being as making it, actually the wealthiest individuals spend a very small portion of their wealth on a home. So again, you could rent, it could potentially allow you to have more opportunities and pursue more opportunities, and you could still be financially successful without a home. But again, I do agree homes are less affordable now, but I just want to highlight in case anybody else feels this way, you could look into alternatives, into how you can hit what is financially successful for you without necessarily buying a home in your young adulthood.
Something that bears out in the data.
The pandemic did have a lot to do with it. I saw how much I was saving and I was like, maybe I shouldn't be paying, upwards of $3,000 a month and making somebody else richer when I could stay at home, save that money, and spend it on where I want to spend it. Between my job and my bartending and waitressing, I make anywhere from $85,000 to $95,000 a year. I would say.
Well, that was more than I was expecting. But again, this individual has highlighted basically they gave the alternative of either paying rent of $3,000, which is probably rent by yourself, most likely. I think most homes, even if you looked into like New York, they're in the 3,000s for like a 1 bedroom, but you could just get a 2 bedroom with a roommate or a 4 bedroom with a few roommates, and that would be noticeably less. And they highlighted the alternative as not giving away money. So again, this seems to be reinforcing, in my mind, the caricature of an individual who is choosing to not spend money on rent at all because their parents aren't taking it from them in any way. And they're choosing to spend that money on something that they enjoy. So instead of spending $3,000 a month on rent to have presumably an apartment by yourself, they're spending $3,000 a month on what they would like to enjoy. And they already make 85, 90K. Like, this is where that's a great salary. Like, I'm pretty sure that's certainly above the median household income in America. So that means this individual is already making more than over 50% of most families in America, and they're still choosing to stay at home. So this definitely is more of like a lifestyle choice, more so than anything else, as opposed to the alternative being 85, 90K is impossible to live off of, but then that would mean 50, 60+% of Americans are completely homeless, which is not what we see in reality. People do struggle, and I'm not saying that it's easy to have a home and have a family and make less than 85, 90K as this individual is. It's certainly not easy, but it's doable. And this individual is choosing to not partake in that. And again, there are alternatives that they could have had, like roommates. So this does seem to be a prevalent option, and it is something that's normalized. I think it's okay, generally speaking. I think it's fine to stay at your parents' home for some amount of time. Presumably there should be guardrails, or maybe they should be charging these individuals rent to some extent just to like get them accustomed to how normal life works. This individual will almost never have a scenario where they will never pay anything for housing. Whether they eventually choose to rent or they buy a home, they'll likely have to pay a mortgage. So their current scenario is unrealistic to what most people realize as what life is. And again, kind of going to what I said earlier, it is almost robbing this person. And I do think this is something where, while I'm not a parent of a young adult or a parent at all at this point in time, I'm sure it's easier said than done to kind of push your child out of the nest. But again, this is where I think it comes out of good intentions. The parents are probably trying to help their child, and they see this as why have them struggle. But again, in my perspective, allowing someone to struggle isn't the same thing as not caring for them or not loving them in some way. Sometimes having somebody struggle is caring for them, is being kind to them, and is loving them for the long term. Because if they could struggle now, then maybe they will struggle less in the future. And that might be something that this individual is not considering.
About 40 to 50% of my salary is going right into savings. My mentality is, why rent and give my money to someone else when I can start to own? And so a big chunk of that money is going to go towards a down payment on a house.
Young adults ages 25 to 34 in high cost of living areas are more likely to live with their parents. Nearly 26% of young adults in New Jersey were living with at least one of their parents in 2022. The median household income in Oceanport, New Jersey, where the Franklins live, was nearly $133,000 in 2022, while the median value of a home in the region was around $644,000.
My dad built this house for $350,000 and was making probably $10,000 to $15,000 less than I was. My mom wasn't working at the time, and they were able to afford a $350,000 house on a $70,000 a year salary with a son. And that's not even the American dream anymore. That's not even possible. My aunt, who I fight with all the time, is always saying how you have to give somewhere, right? And my cousin said something to her the other day and said, we're giving everywhere. We don't get property. We don't get good school systems. Whatever we're trading off is too much to trade off.
Victoria had brought up some conflict with her aunt a few times.
Oh, this is my Aunt Judy.
So I asked Aunt Judy to come on over and talk to us.
This is going to be good. I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen here. Again, I don't think I agree with this individual. They highlighted that they're trading off too much, which is they're not owning a home, they're not doing other things. I think another thing that can also be lost in context is, well, one, their parents had highlighted a $350,000 home, whereas she's comparing herself to having a $650,000 home or more. And so if she found a home for $350,000, she might be able to afford that with 85, 90K a year. And it's not like their parents just came out of the womb and got that house. She didn't highlight how old these individuals were. They already had a child at that point. But also for some of these older generations, many of them entered the marketplace and the workforce without having a college degree. And so sometimes you could get a fairly respectable salary with not that much education. But these individuals, like if you said somebody who's in their 30s got a home 30 years ago, that individual could have gotten a high school degree and then have been working for 10, 12, 14 years to be in their early 30s or late 20s and be buying a home. And so that's a good amount of experience that they have and have progressed in their career up to that point. Obviously, if nowadays it's much more prevalent for basically everyone to have, or a much higher portion to have undergraduate degrees. So people are entering the workforce probably in their still early to mid 20s instead of their like late teens, like at 18 or something like that. So they're probably about 4 years behind. And some people even take time before, they take time after. And some people even go to like higher education beyond that into like graduate degrees or PhDs. And so you might not actually be entering the workforce until you're closer to your 30s. And so it isn't really apples to apples to compare somebody who has a handful of years of experience compared to maybe their parents who had a decade or more of experience in their careers and were buying a home. But we'll see. Again, that certainly sounds like something of privilege from my perspective. I think, well, I guess all of you can tell me, and please share it in the comments, what your perspective is on this. But this individual is choosing not to struggle because they have opportunities otherwise. But not everyone has those opportunities. There's some people who don't have family that they can rely on, or family that don't have their own home that's paid off, etc., that they can just rely on these individuals. And so there's certainly many people who have it much worse than them. And I would guess, and I would personally be betting on the people who are struggling at this point in time, who are a similar age to this individual, who are not getting basically like a free ride from their parents for housing. And that in 10 years from now, those people are probably going to be doing better. That's at least my belief, is I think if you go through those struggles and you push and you aspire to more, you will make it happen. Whereas this individual is likely going to be lost in whatever it is they're doing, and they will never make a hard choice just to avoid struggles in their life. And I think that will eventually lead to them not finding success as an individual. But again, let me know what you guys think.
I talked about how much we fight about millennials, yes, but millennials living at home, and how you always say, well, you have to sacrifice something, but how much we're sacrificing. Like, we don't get like a big property, or we don't get like a nice house, or it's not in a good school system.
Big property, good school system. These are like wish list items. This is, maybe I'm talking too much. Maybe I'm just jealous of this individual. Maybe that's what's happening. They have such a nice house with presumably relatively wealthy family members. Maybe I'm taking it out on her, but again, big house with a good school system is like, that's not something everybody has. That's not like, it's not like every person just enters the world and is guaranteed a big house and a good school system for their children with relative comfort and ease of their job. Obviously, I would expect most of the people listening to this, that isn't going to be true for you. And again, they're kind of comparing like this ideal lifestyle to like what they can get, and they're just saying that's not fair. And I guess to their point, it isn't, but most of life isn't fair, and other people lived with this and dealt with it, and their parents, I'm sure, struggled themselves in order to figure that out and get to where they are. So curious to see what this aunt is going to say, because I feel like I'm probably going to side with whatever the aunt has, because it sounds like she's given it to this individual straight so far.
You have to start somewhere. You have to start anywhere. Just start your portfolio is what I told you. I don't care what it is. You don't have to live in Oceanport your first time.
No, but you were able to live in.
Yeah, totally agreed with this lady so far. Yeah, keep saying it. Also, another thing, it sounded like she was going to say, but you lived in Oceanport. I don't know what Oceanport is for New Jersey. It's just where their parents happen to live. Another thing that people might not realize is that their parents lived in areas that like improved over time, especially if you're close to a city. This happens all the time where I know in the area that I live, where I live certainly wasn't considered a particularly nice neighborhood. And the places that I think of as nice neighborhoods now, if you ask people who are 30, 40, 50 years older, they would say the areas that I think of as nice areas to live in, they thought were not good areas to be in as well. And so it's not like everything is static and like one good area has been a good area for all time. But anyway, I'll try to stop interrupting this individual. I'm so looking forward to what this aunt has to say.
Oceanport the first time.
Okay, I guess it was different times.
Gen X and baby boomers may have a tougher time understanding what young adults are going through today because they enjoyed, until the pandemic recession hit, a solid almost 15 years of uninterrupted economic expansion. Baby boomers, Gen X, they weathered many economic downturns, including major recessions. But I think the big difference is that when they were starting to form their own households and starting to accumulate wealth, housing and higher ed were both more affordable relative to their incomes than they are now.
When I started out, I was making $35,000 a year. That was nothing. And he was making $35,000 a year. You guys are making six figures together. You can't tell me you can't afford a house. They just don't want to spend their money.
Told ya.
I'm sorry.
No, I don't know.
Did you want it? What was my first house? 250 maybe? 270?
That doesn't exist anymore. Where am I finding a $270,000
I'm
house?
not making $35,000 a year. Combined, we made 70.
In 1995, $70,000 was the equivalent of $145,000 today.
Yeah, look at that, see?
Yeah, but those numbers weren't so far off. Again, they're trying to claim this as a victory. Maybe I'm too biased against this individual at this point, but we don't know exactly how much these individuals are making. She did already highlight the one that we're following so far. She makes 85 to 90K, and the aunt has already stated a number of times that they make more than 100K combined. And they also have referenced that the median home price in the area she's referencing is 650K, and that basically the combination would have been maybe her making a little bit less. But again, that would have been 145K for the income for the aunt. And the home price would have been about 555,000. So those numbers aren't completely off. Also, as a bartender or whatever it is that this individual is doing, like, I don't know what the aunt does for a living or what the dad did for a living, but I wouldn't consider bartenders to be like the highest paying job. And so for you to have a concession of 15% compared to the median home price in an area you want to live in to have a reasonable home, or maybe 20% or something like that, doesn't sound outrageous to me. But again, we'll see what they have to say on this.
We do also have a situation that what is really good for an individual person or an individual family is not necessarily good for the entire macroeconomy.
The Federal Reserve estimates in a 2019 paper that young adults who move out of their parents' house would spend around $13,000 more per year on things such as housing, food, and transportation.
One of the big boosts to consumer spending is when people form households. Whether you're a renter or a buyer, you need to furnish that house. You need to fix things up in the home to make it livable. You end up spending a lot of money during that time. So if the pace of household formation slows down, then that's going to slow down the pace of consumer spending, and that will produce a drag on the economy.
Another issue is that there aren't enough affordable properties in popular areas for younger people who are in entry-level jobs and making less money.
Any sort of housing policy needs to be multi-pronged. Are there homes that are at the price point of these prospective home buyers? What can we do to increase the housing supply? What can we do to build? What can we do to help elder Americans, to help them downsize and move into more right-sized homes that will open up larger homes for young families? So I think one alone is not really going to do it. We've got to look both at demand as well as supply.
The other major factor here is how much student loan debt young Americans have. 59% of U.S. adults say they've delayed financial milestones because of their student debt.
I do have a student loan payment. It's about $480 a month. So that's my largest expense.
The liability could be worse for Black borrowers who tend to have...
Wait a second. I gotta watch that again. Did she just say $480 is her largest expense?
Say they've delayed financial milestones because of their student debt.
I do have a student loan payment. It's about $480 a month. So that's my largest expense.
Okay. I feel like they didn't do the segment justice. I feel like for me, I wish they went with some like minority individual or like an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. I feel like I would have respected the individual so much more who they highlighted who is actually struggling, but somebody who makes 85, 90K a year and their largest expense is $480 a month is, I don't know, maybe I'm too jaded at this point for this video. But that doesn't sound like struggle in any way to have your largest expense be like, I think like 90K over the course of a month is like 7,000 maybe plus dollars. Obviously they're going to get taxes taken out, etc. But their largest expense is probably less than 1% of, or not less than 1%, less than 10% of what they make and what they take home. And so they have 10% budget for their needs or their biggest expense and then 90% to do whatever they want with. Like, that's just not a realistic expectation. Like I certainly don't have 90% of my salary to spend on whatever I want. I'm sure you guys don't. I wish they had a more relatable individual that they used for this example, because I'm not loving the fact that this person is so privileged and they're trying to use them as an example of potentially a good example. Like, this individual seems to be reinforcing these facts. So again, the entire tone of this video seems to be highlighting how reasonable it is for people to be doing this. And I find that the individual they used was probably like the least reasonable example they could have given to reinforce that message.
Liability could be worse for Black borrowers who tend to have higher than average student loan debt and less wealth than white counterparts.
Yeah, that would have been, you should have gotten a Black person to follow and ask them about their struggles with their parents in a giant house in New Jersey. That would have been interesting as well, but that probably wouldn't be realistic. They probably would have had to gone to like a much smaller house, and those people probably don't want to hang out in their parents' small house, maybe if they have a house at all. And so that would have been much more interesting if they followed. Maybe they'll do a new segment in the future, but if anyone has connections to CNBC, let them know. I'm interested to find out what this would have been like if they got like a Black individual to follow on this segment who might be living at home.
Black and Hispanic respondents were more likely to say that debt was holding them back from reaching financial milestones. Less than half of white respondents said the same. The amount of debt young adults held also rose substantially between 2005 and 2014, during that period of strong escalation in that cohort living with their parents.
Aggregate student loans are such an enormous part of the economy now, and that's not a reflection of younger people making bad choices with their education. It's really a consequence in large part due to the fact that there's less public funding and going to college just is more expensive, which makes it even harder for even those college grads who are hoping to get earning more money as a result of their college degrees.
Student loan debt by itself can't explain the phenomenon, especially considering so many European countries with much less student loan debt have higher rates of young adults living with their parents. 24 out of 29 European countries had more 18 to 34-year-olds living with their parents in 2021 than the US. It was over 70% in Italy, Portugal, Greece, Serbia, and Croatia.
Yeah, so I just want to pause here. So this does seem to be a trend that is increasing across a variety of countries. Again, I think my personal belief is that it is reasonable. I think again, to share some of my background, especially for new viewers who might already be hating my take on this so far, as they probably perceive me as potentially another privileged white man in America. So I'm sure already those people have dropped out of watching this video and or left an interesting comment for me. But for myself, I'm Hispanic as well. I came out of college with over six figures in debt, and I was only able to get through college working multiple jobs. I was spending more time working than going to school in order to afford it, and still racked up that much debt. And while my parents probably would have been able to allow me to stay at their home, there was no jobs in the area that they lived in. So that wouldn't have helped me out financially, so I didn't really have that option. And my parents are immigrants. So for anybody who completely disagreed with anything that I said based off of what they think I am or my background, I do think it is good to have young adults stay with their parents. Also coming from a more Hispanic and immigrant background, people stay with their families much longer, like also older adults. So it's pretty common for like grandparents to live with their children or parents to live with their children as they age. And so I do expect that as a norm within my family and what I've grown up with. And so for me, it's reasonable that you as a child would live with your parents. It should be reciprocal. If you're struggling, you should be able to stay with your parents and they should be able to help support you a little bit longer. And also you should be able to support them when they are struggling in the future. So I do agree with the phenomenon. But again, for me, I'm just struggling with the example that they gave, as I found that was a very unrelatable example that they gave that individual who seems to come from a fairly privileged background. But I'm totally in favor of kids and children and young adults staying at their parents' house and setting themselves up well for the future.
My boyfriend is Brazilian, and multi-generational homes are very common in almost everywhere else in the world, except in the United States. So I'm just taking a page of their playbook.
The Americans are probably the only people that they're not multi-generations in one house. And I don't have a problem with it. I mean, I think it's kind of nice. Why do we have to be so cold to push everybody out?
You know, there are a lot of cultures out there in which it is normal to live with your parents until you get married. And I don't think there's necessarily an economic explanation for that.
The Franklins would say in the US, it is the economy. But Victoria's mom is kind of okay with it.
Unfortunately, it is the economy and the world that we live in that just doesn't allow them to go live a comfortable life. So with them living here was no big deal. It's not really a problem. They're saving their money. Eventually they'll buy a house, and that works.
I certainly found that to be an interesting video. If you enjoyed what you saw, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.